The sort of thing that happens with the French Revolution, where you get, the Committee of Public Safety and whatever, Robespierre going more and more, there it is. If you look at the cases where our judicial system and our system of protection, let me try and prove my own historical method. What do I mean? What I mean is let's get the basic.
Hello, David. It's extremely nice to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you.
And you've been known as a historian, as the person who is not afraid to speak uncomfortable truth. And I'm curious, this might be the question that not many people asked you, but after everything you've done, after everything you've experienced, after all the battle against cancel culture, how would you describe yourself and how would you like to get remembered?
Interesting. I'm now very ancient. I just celebrated my 80th birthday. I've had really several lives. There's the business in English of cats having 9 lives. I haven't quite had 9 lives, but I've had very different lives as time has gone on, and I've wandered in different directions. I remember back in the 1990s, somebody who I was then very close to, very distinguished fellow historian, a man called Conrad Russell, the Earl Russell, Bertrand Russell's youngest son, said to me, "David, you don't know what you want to do." And I've always been one of those people who's tended to go in some ways, you describe me as words like, courage, saying uncomfortable truths, suggesting that there's a kind of noble directed path. That's not quite what happened. If I go back to the beginning of my career as an academic, I was in the 1960s, 70s. It was totally straightforward academic career. Most of the greats, I was not particularly interested in politics. Now, there were things about me that are consistent. The business of the speaking of the mind, the asking uncomfortable truths, challenging received opinion, but I was doing it within my own discipline. I was doing it within Tudor history. So I famously had a major dispute with my great mentor, with Geoffrey Elton, Sir Geoffrey Elton, challenging him, daring to challenge him directly on his central thesis about the development of English government. And I remember, and it's very important to recognise how ambiguous relationships like these are, that it began as somebody that I immensely valued, that I deeply respected, that taught me really to think seriously about history for the first time in my life. But even when I was an undergraduate in his special subject class in my 3rd year, I did what I suppose was really rather unthinkable. I corrected him on a document that I've always had. Clearly, I'm interested in the arts. I'm devoted to languages, and so on. But I've always had a quasi-scientific mind. When I was a schoolboy, up to what we call the point at which you specialise, up to what were then known as O-levels, before you went into the 6th form, my best subjects were physics and chemistry. But I wasn't a good enough natural mathematician to go on and do the natural sciences, and I was very lucky. There were 2 other boys in my class who, like me, went to Cambridge, but to study, in their case, the natural sciences, me to study history. So history was the art subject which was nearest, if you like, to the scientific approach. And indeed, in French, you talk about the historical sciences, meaning that it is systematic study, that there is the valuing of precision, of accuracy, of the careful comparison of documents and whatever. And I've always been very, very good at that. I know I have the reputation of flamboyance and all the rest of it, which I do, but I happen underneath it to have this rather uncomfortably rigorous scholarship. I'm even good at things like financial history, which, bearing in mind how extravagant I am in personal life, rather surprises people. Anyway, I began by actually challenging Elton on his classification of a document. I can't now remember whether he'd called it a proclamation, it was in fact a circular letter, or it was to sheriffs, or the other way around. But anyway, I was right. And he took it very, very well, and clearly regarded this as a testament if somebody was bright. But anyway, when I went on I got first-class degree, I was meeting him in the summer, this would be the summer of 1967, after I graduated. I knew I was going to become his research student. He treated one very well. He was one of the few people at Cambridge at that point to treat research students as real human beings rather than people that you just saw occasionally. So he welcomed me to his home, which was then a little house in Pretoria Road. He was just about to move into a grand pile that the immense success of his books on Tudor history had bought for him in Millington Road, but I was told not to talk about that. Anyway, we went to the pub, and I shocked him by asking for gin and tonic rather than a pint, and he clearly thought, I got a rum one here. And then he said, right, you're a bright boy, you're going to do the Exchequer. I said, no.
Oh.
And I said, I want to study the royal court. Oh, I've shown it's of no importance. I don't think I quite said at that point, I don't believe you. But what I did, I told him why I had grave doubts, that my second undergraduate essay was actually on Anne Boleyn, the second queen of Henry VIII. And how on earth was I in 1964? Nobody wrote about women, it wasn't yet fashionable. Why was I doing it? I was doing it because I'd had an extraordinary experience of doing very well at school, going up to a rather second grade college at Cambridge, let's be truthful, Fitzwilliam. It wasn't even a college at that point. It was desperately trying to become one. And we had a very, very mixed group of supervisors. And I had a woman called Helen Clover. And she was a medievalist. She specialised in transcribing the lives of minor Celtic saints. And at the end of my first class with her on Tudor history, my first supervision, and the man who was with me is still alive, Chris Widows, and can actually testify to this. At the end of that class, she said to me, you know more about this than I do.
Wow.
Catastrophic, how stupid. To a bumptious, a bit like you, a bumptious 19-year-old, full of himself and whatever. Anyway, but what she then said, well, go and do different things. And I did an essay on Margaret Beaufort, which was terrible, and I found her very unsympathetic, though I've since become very interested in her. But the one on Anne Boleyn, because there was an amazing 19th century book, and of course terribly old-fashioned then, nobody read it, by a man called Paul Friedman, which used the large swathes of the original dispatches of the imperial ambassador Eustache Chapuis, and my French was very good then. I'd spent a stretch of time in France between school and Cambridge. So I read it all very easily. And it became clear to me at that point that there was a whole world of politics round Henry VIII, very, very much like the thing round Trump. The thing that's clear about Trump is a monarch. He sees himself as a monarch. Mar-a-Lago is a palace. You remember when his Secretary of State, when Mario Rubio went into the Élysée Palace, magnificent gilded Louis XVI interior in France, he said to an absolutely appalled President Macron, "Oh, this looks just like Mar-a-Lago, which is plastered in vulgar gold leaf, but it is the court, and you can see Trump operating like a monarch, the use of the signature, the performance and the signing of documents, the surrounding with a clique of people like Elon Musk that hold no elective office at all, but are in favour. So that I'd already discovered that world as an undergraduate, and when I was 19, that was always in my mind. So when I read, well, I was already familiar with Elton's thesis that somehow under Henry VIII, government became bureaucratic, depersonalised, that Thomas Cromwell invented instruments of state like the Privy Council, which excluded the king, Henry VIII, for God's sake, from real power. I knew it was rubbish. I'd already realised that there were ways that you could simply show that it was. And again, the idea that the king was actually not simply pushed out of the central political process, but more importantly, out of the control of the inner instruments of government. And again, Trump has revived these things, which is why I think he's got this gut appeal to people. Unlike most modern politicians, you can actually see power in operation. You can see how here is an individual who has changed things, is determined to impose his will, all the sorts of things that have largely vanished from Western politics. But I knew that that's what Henry VIII did. I knew that his signature, I knew that whoever was responsible for getting that signature, that was where power was, where it operated. That couldn't be separated from the king. So I had this. At a very early stage, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew that it was challenging. It would undercut. It would tear down what was the accepted structure of Tudor history. And do you know what? I did it. To begin with, Elton was good and with a degree of grumpiness, sort of accepted it. But the tension, and I played down the extent to which it undercut his argument about a Tudor revolution. But of course, the tensions came to the surface as I became older, more independent, and started to publish more, write more, and eventually we had a most terrible public quarrel in which he tried to destroy not only my reputation, but that of those who'd worked with me. And I replied with a devastating article, which I remember the editor of the Historical Journal, John Morrill had waved his finger at me. He said, there's got to be no fisticuffs in this. It's got to be kept very polite. And I got the note back saying, yes, it is polite, but you politely dip him in an acid bath feet first. So what I'm saying is, at that point, I had very, very little. Remember, this is the 1960s, 68 going on around me. I barely noticed. I was a little involved in student politics. I'd been in London for a stretch of time, working in what was then called the Public Records Office, then becomes nowadays we've imitated America and called it the National Archives. I was there for a stretch of time. I came back to my college at Cambridge. By this time it was a college. It was being convulsed by student politics. And I played a sort of, in looking back, it's rather interesting. I played a mediating role as a known figure in the college, in the middle common room, that's as it was called then, between the undergraduate common room and the senior common room. I played a mediating role, and I actually wrote a constitution for the student representative body in the college, which in one form or another has actually lasted to the present. despite the fact that the college spat me out because I was far too naughty. That's a recent development. But what I did, and in retrospect, I'm really interested by it. I gave the college, the college student body, a constitution that was deliberately modelled on that of the United States. And that's to say, in which the leader of the student body was not chosen out of a small, cliquish committee, the way you've been describing, how student politics become so violent and whatever. You get a little committee, a cliquish committee, elected, that's more and more extreme. That's very much the sort of thing that happens with the French Revolution, where you get, the Committee of Public Safety and whatever, Robespierre going more and more and more extreme. What I did was to take the countervailing model, which is the American model, because the founding fathers of America were, of course, soaked in the traditions of English parliamentary government, of English representative government. And they came up with the idea of a president who is subject to a form of general election. So you choose this monarchical figure that has to, as it were, be supported by a very large group of people. Now that's an incredibly effective way of marginalising fanatics and silly people. It's a very, very good way of stopping it happening. So even then, I think I had a degree of political flair, even though I wasn't hugely interested in politics. And then what happened was my dissertation, my PhD, was very distinguished. I got one of the only 2 jobs that were available in the year that I finished it, in the year that I had to leave my research position at Cambridge. In 1972, I went to LSE and whatever, and I seemed to be about to embark on a completely ordinary, successful academic career. And then I was seduced by television, and in a completely different direction, totally accidentally. It was simply that a former student of mine, in 1977, a former student of mine, a man called Charles Kitchen, he'd been intended to go into the RAF, the Royal Air Force. He was a cadet, that's to say, he would have been paid a modest salary whilst he was a student, which of course made him much more prosperous than the typical student. You knew he was interested in the RAF because he always wore what was called a Pratt rag, some kind of cravat thing round his neck, and had slight Battle of Britain affectations. But then once he actually joined the RAF, he discovered there were dreadful things, like the fact you're expected to be sober before you flew a plane. You go to the gym occasionally. This wasn't for him. So he joined Granada, one of our, in those days, there were regional ITV companies, and that was the one for the Northwest, which was the most famous, the most effective. And his first job was to find a historian for a programme. And it was an extraordinary programme. We won't go into detail on it. It's barely possible to do so decently. But it's our first piece in 1977, the first piece of reality television in the country, fronted by a man, extraordinary man, called Russell Harty. It was called Behave Yourself, which meant it was all really about misbehaving. And the idea of the programme was you got a group of people from a real-life Coronation Street, very famous soap opera in Oldham, and you got them in a studio and you got them drunk and you got them talking about work and sex and clothes and sex and jobs and sex and sex. And you treated them, I mean, nowadays it's inconceivable, the degree of patronage. You treated them rather like as though you were anthropologists visiting a strange tribe. And so you got in a group of experts, it's really true, to comment on them. We literally had an animal behaviourist, Nick Humphrey from King's College at Cambridge. We had the then head of the anthropological department of the British Museum. We had a leading Harley Street psychiatrist, and they wanted a historian. And Charles's job was to get the historian and he hesitated and hesitated and hesitated. And finally, the director of the programme, John Slater, a man exercised a very important, in some ways malign, other ways beneficial influence in my life, very physical. And Charles has been hesitating. John grabs him by the lapels, back against and finally, after much toing and throwing, Charles says, well, none of them are very much, historians at Cambridge, John said, heaven's sake, you were at Cambridge, you must have seen the brightest and the best. None of them were much good, but I suppose Starkey was the least boring. And that took me into a career in television. And again, that developed different aspects of myself. That's why, because I was spending so much time on that was why Conrad Russell, it's why I've never written, which I should have done, my great book on the court of Henry VIII. I've written lots of other things, but I've never fulfilled the early promise of that research. I'm prepared to admit it, because I was seduced. Why was I seduced? It's suddenly a world of money, of open drinks cabinets, of fun, of, I came from a very modest background, and back in the day, then we're talking about in the 1970s, it was a world when independent television was making money hand over fist. Harold Wilson had tried to tax it by introducing a special profits tax. Well, it's very simple. You don't make a profit, do you? Instead, every drinks cabinet was open. You went out to the most unimaginable meals. In 1977, we went out to a meal in what was then Manchester's only decent restaurant, Truffles, which cost, it was allegedly the only time an expenses claim was ever queried at Granada. It cost £600. When I had been a research fellow at Cambridge up to 1972, I was paid £600 a year. Admittedly, I had my board and lodging. You could buy a flat in London at the beginning of 1973 for £3,000, a one-bedroom flat. So that gives you an idea. So suddenly, this world, and of course it played up to the fact that I've always enjoyed acting. I was a good schoolboy actor, enjoyed debating, language and whatever. And then that led, and so I'm taking you on this path through a really very zigzaggy sort of career. Then, of course, as you get better known, I started to comment. I was invited to commentate, hideous word, on the monarchy. Remember, this is the moment at which, with the tensions and then the breakup of the marriage and then the death of the Prince and Princess of Wales and then the death of Diana, there was huge interest. And nobody really knew anything about it, because there was a whole group of royal commentators, and all they could tell you about was, what woman was wearing what coloured hat. There'd been very, very little serious interest in monarchy. It was, remember, academics in the post-war period go wildly to the left. There is the fashion for, it's a sort of unthinking neo-leftism, the assumption that history is the history of the people. That the aristocracy and monarchy, these are simply a sort of discarded superstructure in neo-Marxist language or whatever. So everything was looking at the common people, looking at trade unions. I mean, I remember when I studied the history of the 19th century at Cambridge, it was completely killed for me by the fact that the history of Britain's great imperial expansion, the reconstruction of our cities, the transformation of industry, the extraordinary conquest of the world by the navy and then the great commercial ship, all of that stuff. What was I taught? I was taught by Henry Pilling about the bloody history of the early Labour Party and trade unions. It was the most tedious stuff. Anyway, it meant that I, who had worked on the royal court, I, who was interested in the role of monarchy, for me it was just natural to slip into the role of royal commentator. And then I got into things like the beginning of my role as a controversialist with The Moral Maze. Again, I remember my title of The Rudest Man in Britain, which I was given by that unimpeachable source of the Daily Mail, was because I had actually defended Prince Charles against a man called George Austin, had a very grand title in the Church of England, though it didn't actually mean very much. He was Archdeacon of York, and he'd been attacking Prince Charles for his immorality and whatever returning to Camilla and whatever. And I've never much liked moralism in public life. When people start proclaiming virtue, then you actually know politics is going to turn bloody and nasty. And somebody like Keir Starmer parading virtue, you know there's something really, really nasty underneath. Anyway, so Austin, this was on The Moral Maze, Austin had delivered himself as some enormous, flatulent diatribe. And as he was leaving the studio, I developed this art of doing a kind of, remember radio? We've now got the business, it's very easy to produce images with text. In those days it wasn't, remember. When I started filming, when I started making television, we're talking about from 77, and then I made my first documentaries in 83, you still used film stock. Immensely expensive and whatever. This is easy, quick, we can afford to do it. Effectively, you can afford to do it. Effectively, in student digs, then you simply couldn't. But I developed in radio where you've got no image, because now they even film radio studios, as people are talking. You couldn't do it. So I came up with this technique of what is really a verbal cartoon, using words to conjure an image. I was talking about the importance of monarchy. Again, image is so important. It's why the cartoon, why the captioned photograph. One of the reasons we remember Diana is she had an uncanny ability to do a pose which the Sun would write a brilliant headline for. So when she's in front of the Taj Mahal, like that. Alone, the word "there's three in the marriage," all of this stuff. She was brilliant at that. Anyway, and I was good in the creation of what I call the verbal cartoon. So as Austin, who was a fat and sweaty priest, was bumbling his way out of the studio, I came up with the line: listen to it carefully. The English is interesting. Doesn't his fatness, his smugness, and his pomposity make you want to vomit? Now, look at that line. It's the fatness, the smugness, English, and then suddenly the Latin, pomposity. And do you know what? I felt so ashamed. That line figured as the centre of poor old George Austin's obituary in the Times. And I thought, really? He was going a bit far. But and of course at that point you become famous. Hence the rudest man in Britain. And I suppose in some ways, again, let me be honest about myself, I've rather played up to that. And to begin with, like a Katie Hopkins or whatever, there was an element of doing it for its own sake. But I think, and remember, you've just asked me one serious question, and I'm now coming to an answer. I become more serious. I still retain, I hope, all the things that I've been talking about: the gift of language, the willingness to say uncomfortable things, the ability to create good word pictures, that smell for fact, that ability to see the big picture, to go through enormous amounts of evidence and come up with a clear interpretation. But it's all become much more serious. And it's become much more serious because our situation has become much more serious. In the period when I was a young man, as I said, 80 now, for the first 7 decades of my life, England, Britain was a place where somebody like me, born in a council house, turned out to be gay. I was born with not very serious disability, but I had club feet and all the rest of it, and minor polio. Doors opened at every stage. What I could do, where I could live, the kind of job that I could have, the things that I could say, the people that I knew. It was a world opening up, floors and ceilings rising, prospects broadening. And there's been this terrible reversal of that since the late 90s, and becoming worse and worse, the altered atmosphere, the atmosphere of cancellation, which of course I suffered from at one point, the imposition of, in fact, very considerable censorship on public speech. As you know, this woman, is it Louise Connolly, was sentenced to jail for 3 years, I think it was, for an incautious tweet at the time of the Southport riots. Whereas people who've committed, well, in fact, there are examples of people committing rape and getting shorter sentences. Something has gone terrifyingly wrong, and the argument that I've been putting forward in the last year or so is that what we experienced from 1997, from the beginning of the premiership of Tony Blair, is a kind of peaceful French Revolution in Britain. Literally, the same kind of fantastical ideas that France adopts from the fall of the absolute monarchy in 1789 onwards, the fall of the Bastille and whatever. All of that was slipped onto an England which had effectively not a straightforward or uniform political history, but largely a stable political history for about 700 or 800 years, clearly changing, clearly broadening, but also itself strong enough actually to change without destroying itself. So England is unique in the 19th century and the early 20th century, that it can actually accommodate to democracy eventually. It can accommodate first the middle class and then the popular vote, the working man and even the working woman, without destroying the constitution of its ancien regime. Everywhere else in Europe, you have to tear the structure down before you can actually change it effectively. In England, Britain, it's sufficiently tensile, it's sufficiently strong that you can actually modernize it. And then it transforms fundamentally from 1997, catastrophically, because you impose alien things on it and you destroy what had been its foundation. And that's why I become more serious. That's why I become politically active. That's why I've redefined myself. When I was doing things like the Moral Maze, I always talked to myself as a libertarian. No more. I become much more committed, a much more serious conservative with big or small c, and much more aware of why I am. I become, my historical interests have by no means forgotten about the Tudors, but I've become much more rooted, much more focused on the 18th and 19th centuries, and I think at the same time I understand my own historical period and the way it fits into the broader pattern of British constitutional history much more clearly. I've also again come to another conclusion, that history itself is the best way by which we can understand the present. Now, in some ways, that's a banal statement, but it isn't, because of course, most most modern commentators on politics resort to things like statistics, so-called political science, all this sort of thing, psephology and whatever, the whole, what I regard as the juju of PPE, politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford. Whereas the right way, I think, the way you begin is not to claim that history repeats itself. That's not true at all. But is to argue essentially and to analyse essentially and even to predict by means of historical analogy. So I become a much more boring person. I'm sorry. You're getting me at the fag end of my life. You know. Yes.
But one of the things that I actually quite like about you is that you've always been able to challenge the narrative that's going on in the world. And there are two things that are two opinions of yours that I find very, very interesting. The fact that you have once spoken, and not once, many times spoken, about the fact that over time power has shifted from Westminster. And the second is that UK, the country we're in right now, is primarily ruled by minorities at the moment. So I would like you to expand on those two things.
Yes. Well, let's again, let me try and prove my own historical method. What do I mean? What I mean is let's get the basic. What was there that went wrong, or rather, which was deliberately made to go wrong? What was this thing that I talked about arising out of Magna Carta and one way or another largely surviving to the end of the 20th century? It's another way of asking the question, why is Britain so preeminent as the originator of the Industrial Revolution? Why does the scientific revolution of the 17th century take place here? Why is there the astonishing growth of not simply one but two British empires? You know, we lose one with the revolt, with the rebellion in America, then immediately gain another bigger one, and it's unique. Every clever person in the late 18th century Europe, including the King of Sweden, said the moment you've lost America, Britain becomes a second-class power, and instead, of course, it led the European coalition against Napoleon, shatters French power forever, and becomes the dominant world power, well, the first real world power in the 19th century, before the torch is handed on to a rather less competent America. Now, how did all that happen? Because what is really important, you come from the world, you come from the old world of the Russian Empire, of the vast stretches of Eastern Europe. We're a tiny little island. Tiny, tiny little island. I wasn't really joking about France. As I always say, all bad ideas are French.
I heard that, yeah.
All bad ideas are French. But France, in the period we're talking about, in the 17th and the 18th century, France is 4 times the size of England. And the disparity in population is much, much greater. By the time you have got to the reign of Louis XIV in the late 17th century, France has got a population of 20 million. Britain is under 8. And yet, in fact, 6 by the late 17th century. It's tiny. So you've got a country which is 4 times the size, a fifth of the population, and nevertheless is capable of taking on and defeating. Now, how on earth can you do that? Why is this little tiny patch of land? Why does it do so much? Well, my answer is essentially political. And this again is something which I think, I've swung in the analysis as well against the tide. Since Marx, virtually all historical explanation has tried to go back to economics, and it's affected the most surprising people. You remember Bill Clinton's electoral guru. It's the economy stupid. I don't think it is the economy stupid. I think it's politics. I think that the Greeks, Aristotle, the practicing Greek politicians like Pericles, as they are reported by Thucydides, they all emphasize that what is the peculiar feature of a state, of a city-state, of a society, is how it organizes itself politically. So I believe that politics is the master science. Politics is architectonic. And there are many, many peculiar things about I call it Anglo-Britain. It's England as it grows with the semi-absorption of the Celtic fringe and whatever. We're very peculiar in our family structure. We don't have extended families in the Middle Ages. That there's a very high level of individualism already, that we have remarkably secure property law, property rights, all of these funny things. What do they come from? Well, more than anything else, I think, although it's chicken and egg at this point, it comes from our political structures. That from Magna Carta onwards and the immediate aftermath of Magna Carta, you develop this very clear idea that it begins as a kind of bit of a general idea, and then it gets clothed very quickly in specific institutions, that the governed and the governors are not simply the governor is up there and the governed down here, rather that there's a reciprocal relationship between them, and that in some sort of way, although you sort of give the king a coronation and you anoint him and all the rest of it, he is effectively answerable. There's a notion to the people. There's a notion that the government needs to be at least answerable. Answerable may be the wrong word. To be responsible, and that idea quickly clothes itself in the form of a parliament, in which you have a body in which everybody who matters sits. The king sits, the nobles sit, the bishops sit, the leading representatives of the towns and the counties all sit within the same body. Some of them sit, like the king and the nobles, by hereditary right. The bishops sit by election and choice within the church. The representatives of the counties and the towns, they're actually elected by a highly variable franchise of people in the counties and the towns. But there's an idea which is, to begin with, highly theoretical, but as time goes on, becomes more and more near to reality, that why an act of parliament, the decision of this body, binds everybody, why it's got a particular authority, is because everybody is present in it. And therefore, everybody shares in that decision. And the phrase is, everybody is bound by an act of parliament because it's presumed they're there. You're there either in person or you're there by your representative.
Fair enough, yeah.
And so it's this notion of the binding nature of a consent that you share in. In other words, law isn't simply imposed from the outside. It's not a top-down fiat of a monarch. The ultimate form of lawmaking is a participatory one. Now, this seems to me to produce extraordinary difference. It's why traditionally we didn't have an armed police force. It's why there is the notion of policing by consent, as opposed to the gendarmerie of continental Europe and whatever. I remember when I was in France in 1958 at the time of de Gaulle's coup, I've never forgotten the sight of police with submachine guns around the Palais Bourbon, the place where the French Assemblée Nationale sits. I've never forgotten it, or my shock at it. And that seemed to me, that notion of that complex politics, which of course gives enormous latitude to strong and effective kings. What we forget is that Parliament is not the creation of weak kings. It's created by strong kings who essentially, and it's created through war. Again, all of these things are unsayable. There's a very close relationship between representative government and warfare. It's again the ancient Greek world. So what we then do, we develop this extraordinarily, if you like, precocious politics, which is why English gives these words, these ideas to the world. The idea of parliaments, the idea of elections, general elections, all these things which have become just absolute commonplace notions of how you do government are invented here. And broadly speaking, that seemed to me to work. As I said, it's astonishing that it's capable in the 19th century of transforming to reflect the altered social reality of an industrialising, first a commercial, and then an industrialising society. In 1832, the franchise is broadened to include the literate middle class. In 1867, the skilled worker, and then from that point onwards, right up to the beginning of the 20s, all men and all adult women. And it survives. There's then this great break in 1997. And there is the way you can characterise most neatly what the Blair government does is to say, we will take power away from Parliament. Why? Because Parliament is the one area of government that is directly answerable to the people. The whole thing is based essentially on a fear and dislike of the people. And we need to understand this. Now, in English terms, this is something very odd. Of course, many politicians have had profound doubts about the mob. You will remember Churchill saying democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. Jokes like that. But what happens with Blair is something very different. Let's look at what he actually does and then investigate why he does it. What he does, essentially, is to strip power away from Parliament to bodies which are not susceptible to public election. So you first of all, you begin in 1997, right at the beginning, removing absolutely key decisions from politicians. It's very odd. In other words, they deliberately divest themselves of power. And they begin, of course, the man who I think very much is the master of all of this, the master theoretician of all of this behind Tony Blair, is Gordon Brown. And you begin with the famous, very much, nobody can accuse them of not trailing what they were going to do. Nobody can accuse them of not saying what they would do. The decision to give what was called independence to the Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee. But what that means is that the most important single decision in the management of the economy, the setting of interest rates, is given to a body of so-called experts. People that you cannot remove, people that are not answerable to anybody, people who were chosen by obscure processes. And then you go on and you multiply such bodies. You create English nature, which is responsible effectively for the management of the landmass. This is why, and for very, very strange orders of priorities. This is why, when you were trying to build the high-speed railway line, HS2, when you go through an area where there were supposedly some rare bats, you have to construct a bat tunnel at the cost of £100 million. It's why you exclude vast swathes of the country from being able to be built upon, because you claim that having houses and sewage will alter the nitrate or phosphate balance or whatever it is in the soil. So in other words, you have conceded a vast area of public policy to a body of experts. But of course, these experts, pretty much by definition, they're single-issue experts. They're fanatics. English nature is run by Tony Juniper, who is an eco-fanatic. You then go on and you create the Climate Change Committee. And as we increasingly commit to the notion of net zero, this body effectively controls the whole swathe of energy policy, energy usage, and so on, and so on, and so on. And we finish up with something like, I think at the last count, it's of the order of 240 of these bodies. 1/3 of state expenditure, something like £340 billion a year, is handled through them. In other words, not directly controlled by Parliament, which means that the people controlling it are not directly answerable to the electorate. Now, this is why, of course, the meaning of the word expert has become a deeply debatable one. Yes, we need experts. I'm an expert. I'm very serious academic historian. I value expertise. I value the fact that I can read difficult to decipher historical documents, that I have the command of the common forms, that I understand what they mean, and so on. That is expertise. Of course, I value it. But the important thing about expertise is that expertise should be within a broader context. There's this wonderful remark, it's sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill, it's sometimes to Theodore Roosevelt, who's a very impressive American president, the first Roosevelt president at the beginning of the 20th century, which is they're talking about one particular variety of expert, they're talking about scientists. You want your scientists on tap, but not on top. Now look at what happens. We have one very clear example of the problem of expert rule, of single issue rule, single issue expert committee rule, which was the COVID committee, which was the SAGE committee when we had the lockdown during the COVID epidemic. It was catastrophic because here what did you have? You had a very serious, very heavyweight committee consisting of epidemiologists, of scientific experts, of medical statisticians and all the rest of it. They had one single concern, which was to make sure as few people as possible died of COVID. Well, isn't that sensible? Well,
in theory, yeah.
One second. But what if their determination to reduce the number of deaths from COVID meant that they didn't greatly care, for example, if people died of heart attacks? They were positively indifferent if they died of cancer. The NHS became, instead of a national health service, it became a national COVID service. You literally shut down all other forms of medicine. Hospitals simply treated one disease, and by the way, it turns out treated it wrongly. Putting people in the ICUs with the artificial lungs actually killed them. The process of intubation actually killed them. It's perfectly clear. We now know. We spent endless money on creating hospitals and on buying these machines, none of which were used. Money was treated as being of no object. In order to stop people catching COVID, you will remember, you decided to close the entire economy down. We spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. And because we'd shut the economy down, people, of course, had to be paid money, so we paid them for doing nothing. Now, what does that do? First of all, we incur debts because of COVID that are on the same scale as a world war. Deranged. And still worse, because you pay people for doing nothing, people get in the habit of doing nothing. And people wonder why we've suddenly seen this extraordinary increase in people of working age who don't do anything. We have now 9 million people of working age who don't work.
Yeah.
What happens? It transpires, of course. The people who were essentially at risk of COVID were ill conscious, like me. The joke that I always make, because I think you should be able to joke about the most serious things. Do you know what the average age of death from COVID was?
50.
83. What is the average age of death from all causes?
like 30.
82. So I said, get COVID, live longer.
Oh my God.
But in other words, what happened was we went mad. But the rule of a single issue committee made us mad. Only the elderly were serious. I mean, a handful of other people. There were people with odd genetic dispositions, all of that sort of thing. But the one group of people who were practically guaranteed not to get it were the young. And what did we do? We shut down schools. And it's now clear that not simply the education, but the whole life development of a generation of school children has been utterly and irretrievably damaged. That's the consequence of government by a single issue committee that's not answerable. Because what happened during COVID was all the media doing? Saying more, tighter restrictions. What was Starmer, as leader of the opposition, doing? Saying, lock down faster, lock down harder, lock down longer. There was any notion of politics that could debate, any notion of a politics which I believe passionately in which there's... You ask me why I say things. Because there's the basis of all good government is debate, is the ability to weigh arguments against each other, the basis of all scholarship, of all science. And if you lose that freedom, if you cease to have individuals who can handle fact, who know the difference between fact and fiction, and who are prepared to present arguments powerfully and forcefully, to challenge received opinion, remember, all progress is the work of the heretic. All progress comes when somebody says no to something which is a received opinion which is false. All progress depends on being naughty. It's why I'm rather fond of particularly naughty young men. We won't pursue that. We won't pursue that. we won't pursue that too strongly. Because they tend to be the great dissenters. And I come from with the term dissenter, of course, has a meaning specifically in England and in English. It's those who did not follow the established church. And I come from a long family tradition of dissent. So that was one of the great disasters of the Blair government. You heave power away from those who can be voted out towards experts who again have got a tendency to fanaticism, to focus on one thing, which is disastrous, but also to be highly self-serving. And it attracts a particular kind of mindset. It's the whole world that values over-regulation, the whole world that's been seduced by diversity, equality and inclusion and whatever. That's very much that world. But then you do something else. You incorporate completely alien concepts into English law, notions like universal human rights. And you reconstruct our system of law. Remember, again, the peculiarity about England, Anglo-Britain, because the constitution is simply the old English constitution, with additions of representatives of Scotland, Wales, whatever. The peculiar thing about Parliament was there was no separation of powers, none of this mythical separation into executive, judicial and legislative. How can you have when the Prime Minister, who is head of the executive, sits in the legislative and normally largely controls its operations? At the same time, Parliament is a supreme lawmaking body, and the monarch, who is the final apex of the triangle of Parliament, is the source of justice and so on. And instead what we did, we played around with these strange notions that were partly borrowed from America, but much more borrowed from France and from the speculations on the British Constitution by French writers like Montesquieu. And we borrowed these fatal notions, really, really fatal notions, like universal human rights, and we incorporate the European Convention on human rights into British law. Now, here again, Vladimir, human rights sound lovely. What could be nicer? I call it the Paddington Bear approach to society. You know, this sweet, cuddly, furry little thing that's got a little luggage nailed around its neck that says Peru, and therefore it's nice to asylum seekers. It's got its little suitcase, so there's a slight touch of maybe the poor Jew being carted off to the concentration camp or the evacuee, and there's marmalade and sweet sugar and vomit-making sentimentality. Human rights sound lovely, but what does let's just investigate. What does it mean if you say there is a European Convention on Human Rights and you give a European court, the power to enforce it over your own parliament and over your own courts? What does that actually say about the origins of law? Remember, in Britain, we've had for, as I said, 700 years, the notion that the supreme force of law is the consent, in however you want to express it, of the nation. If there's something above the nation that can actually tell the nation what to do, what does that say about our notion of consent? It says, well, it's actually worthless. There's a higher authority. Of course, the idea that there's a higher authority is completely meaningless. It's an absurdity and an invention. But again, how can you believe that there is a European, or still more so, because there's also a United Nations, universal declaration on human rights? If you believe that there are universal human rights, you've got to believe there's a universal human being. Finally, you must believe we're all the same. That, by the way, frontiers are probably a very bad idea. That really any distinction between the citizen and the foreigner. I remember, I vividly recall a few years ago appearing on a discussion programme with that very strange man called Paul Marsh. And I talked about somebody as a foreigner. How dare you use a word like foreigner?
Is it not allowed?
Well, because it's diminishing, they're people, you'll think, you'll get them saying, they're people actually like us. Well, actually, when you look at them landing from those boats from the Channel, they're not remotely people like us. And there's been this extraordinary sloppy-mindedness that thinks, well, we're all really the same. Whereas what I believe passionately is there are vast differences between even the English and French, although we're only separated by 20-odd miles. That we are products. You are as a citizen of a country, as an inhabitant of a country, you're a product of literally hundreds of years of development of institutions, of ideas, of language, things that you literally absorb with your mother's milk. And we've thrown all that out of the window, with utterly disastrous consequences. So, in principle, then, the idea of universal human rights and human rights in general seems to be utterly wrong. But also, the practice of it, and this is where we come to your minorities point, the practice of it has turned out to be absolutely deadly because of the role of judges in interpreting it. The man who seems to me to be more than anybody else responsible, not for the quangocracy side of taking power away from Parliament, but from the judicial side of taking power away from Parliament, is a man who enjoys an immense reputation in the legal world, now dead quite many years, a man called Tom Bingham, who was the last senior law lord before very much Bingham-esque creation of the Supreme Court was set up, again by Tony Blair. And Bingham writes a book on the so-called rule of law, in which he announces this very, very high place that human rights law and international law plays in law. And he never quite, in the published stuff in Britain, says what he really thinks. He did in Australia. And he gave a lecture in Australia in which he sets out fully and in unvarnished terms what the actual effect of human rights law is. And it goes like this. Human rights law is, by definition, anti-democratic insofar as it is counter-majoritarian. And it is biased, he says it absolutely explicitly, to minorities, to protect them against the majority. And he then lists the minorities: the mentally sick, the gypsy, the asylum seeker, the criminal. Now, if you look at the series of scandals we have had in Britain with the misapplication of human rights law to protect from being deported criminals, rapists, whatever, on the most spectacularly trivial ground, there it is. If you look at the cases where our judicial system and our system of protection of the citizen has collapsed absolutely, the case of the Southport murderer, Ruda Cabana, Kalokane, the man, I've now forgotten where, who just murdered people in the streets. These were people who were evidently severely mentally sick. In any sane society, they would have been in protective custody from the age of about 13. But oh no, they have human rights. Since he's been imprisoned, what has Ruda Cabana done? He has thrown boiling water at his prison guards because, of course, he's got a human right to have a cup of hot tea. This is demented. This is simply demented. But again, it's the problem when you give judges the ability to determine what is really the public interest without the overarching framework of political judgment. No judge should have the right to say, I will simply set aside considerations of public safety on the grounds of the... We're not talking now about whether somebody is guilty or innocent. That is a matter for the judicial process. But what we're talking about is saying whether ordinary legal process should or should not be set aside on grounds of some abstract right, and we ignore the whole question of the Latin phrase, salus populi suprema lex, that the safety of the people, it should be the supreme consideration. We've thrown all this aside. And so what we've done then is we've created a situation in which the power of Parliament is severely eroded by the quango on the one hand, and then by a judicial system which elevates abstract notions above the reality of ordinary human relations. Again, there's something else that not simply is the Human Rights Act is the problem. The particular example is the Equality Act. The Equality Act is completely demented. It takes... imagine you have an Act of Parliament with the title of a single abstract noun. Who voted for equality? We're not equal. There's a profound degree of difference between human beings. What you need, the only equality which makes sense, is a notion of equality before the law. But if you actually look at the attempt at forcing equality, not simply between human beings, but in the worst possible idea, different categories of human beings, because that's what the Equality Act tries to do. It says that men and women should be paid the same amount of money. Absolutely fine. You can measure that with the same job. But it says, oh, that's not good enough. It decides that it can actually come up with a formula in which you can weigh jobs in which the majority of people doing them are men against jobs where the majority of people doing them are women. And how do you do that? The only way you can do it, believe it or not, the Equality Act has actually got a series of equations. An Act of Parliament with equations. And what these equations embody is the most discredited of all economic theories, which is the Marxist theory of the labour of the labour value. Let me get this right. It is the Marxist theory that labour has got an intrinsic value as opposed to what the market says it's worth. And what has been the result of that? That's why Birmingham has gone bankrupt. That we've got now judges determining that the wages that are paid to a group of dinner ladies has got to be comparable to the wages, because of women, has got to be comparable to the wages paid to a group of refuse workers who are men. And the result is compensation. The compensation to Birmingham of the women, as the female workers of Birmingham City Council, is going to total something like £700 million. And wages being set by judges. This is demented. Again, the Equality Act sets up two rival views of rights. The right of sex and the right of gender. One being a biological reality, the other a man-made fiction. Gender belongs in grammar. It only wanders out of the grammar in the 1960s. And you get then this terrible clash over the right of biological women and pretend women, who are of course actually men. And in what's very, very interesting, all of this was predicted at the time of the French Revolution. The French Revolution comes up with these fantastic notions of universal human rights and whatever. They never put it into practice because, of course, the moment you've drawn up these charters of universal human rights, you have the terror. So you've got to shove them all in a box and forget about them. But a brilliant Englishman writes about all of this, a man called Jeremy Bentham, denouncing the idea of universal human rights in 1795. And he comes up with this wonderful phrase, human rights are nonsense, and universal human rights are nonsense on stilts. They were great phrase makers. Anyway, and what he does, he points out, he, as it were, predicts what importing the European Convention and the Equality Act have actually done in England. He says, first of all, if you set up rival rights, you will have a politics of hysteria and violence. Look at what we've seen in the debate over transgenderism. This tiny little issue. I mean, let's be honest. What is a transgendered person? They are a Frankenstein's monster. And do you actually know? It's very important. Again, you were talking about mentioning unmentionable things. What is a man who's been given a vagina? What is that vagina? It is a permanently open wound that requires daily dilation. Absurd, preposterous. Absurd and preposterous. But you've set up that notion of womanhood against real biological womanhood with these intense rages, the rage of the cast of the Harry Potter films against the woman who invents it all. The lunatic amount of public energy and debate that's been devoted to this issue. He predicts that you'll get this politics of absurd sectarian violence. And the second thing he does, he says, how catastrophic is it to legislate abstract principles? Equality. By the way, we haven't finished with the absurdity of the Equality Act. Remember, it is that Equality Act which is both responsible for Birmingham, so absolutely buggering finance, and responsible, the same Act of Parliament, and responsible for the absurdities of transgenderism. Now, how about that as an achievement for one Act of Parliament? Now, well, the problem is we've lost reason in government. If you have a single piece of legislation that's responsible for that, what should you do with it? You should repeal it immediately. But of course, no, it's a matter of principle. That terrible word, abstract general ideas. I was very lucky. My mother was very fond of the word principle. She didn't believe in smacking me or anything. And I was an impossible, you can imagine, I was an impossible child to manage. So everything was a matter of principle. So, and of course, I was very good at winning arguments. So my poor woman, my poor mother, was constantly sort of going, it's a matter of principle. So by the age of 6, I knew what a principle was. A principle is something you feel about so strongly that you won't listen to reason. Whereas, of course, listening to reason has to be the basis of all sensible human relationships. So Blair landed us in this absolutely impossible mess, and it was made supremely impossible because you invented this thing called the Supreme Court. And alongside, in other words, we had an appellate court, which was a branch of Parliament, the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. But on the analogy of America, you create this thing called a Supreme Court, which of course gives lawyers ideas above their standing. I mean, what we've seen is the legal profession thinking that it can tell everybody else. The notion, that we've incorporated this thing called international law, which is a mere arbitrary fiction. But we have an Attorney General, Lord Hermer, who believes in it and tells us we've not only got to give away the Chagos Islands, we've actually got to pay people to take it from us. I mean, delusional. That again, human rights are of necessity incorporated in English law because the idea of the rule of law says that's what it is. And interestingly enough, this extraordinary shift in the meaning of the rule of law. I mean, the rule of law basically just meant proper procedure, but it's reinvented under Blair. It's reinvented again by this man, Tom Bingham, to mean something very different. It's reinvented effectively to mean that law stands alongside the supremacy of Parliament as a kind of joint equal principle, but only the judges can perceive it. So you suddenly moved, whereas judges in the English tradition are firmly under, as it were, in the nature of law itself, not in the application. The judges have the right, and the sole right, to administer law, but we're actually talking about the law they administer. But what's happened, of course, is when you create the thing called the Supreme Court, when you invent a powerful doctrine of the rule of law, which incorporates human rights law, which sits above the law of Parliament, when you incorporate these fantastical notions, these abstract principles, like equality, which, as it were, sit above Parliament, then you get lawyers operating effectively as though, well, they run their own show. And you can see it in two very important ways. You can see it with if we actually look at, I don't think you were here at the time, but as part of the Brexit process, following the election of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, there was a deadlock. When I say election, the election by the Conservative Party of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, there was a deadlock within Parliament, and to break that deadlock, there was a use of what was called prorogation, when you suspend for a short period of time the sitting of Parliament. And astonishingly, the Supreme Court, a case was brought by a woman called Gina Miller, and the arguments were put together by a man who rejoices so appropriately in the name of Lord Panic. And Lord Panic put forward an argument that the essential purpose of Parliament is to hold the government to account. Therefore, to suspend the sitting of Parliament is an affront against the basic function of Parliament. Ergo, the prorogation was illegal. And the idea that the court of law can rule against the government and Parliament exercising its own power of self-government seems to me to break the whole principle of English government since the 17th century, the whole principle of English government since the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights, which declares that proceedings in Parliament are susceptible to no other court. And I was astonished that the government let it stand. I was astonished that it was ever ruled to be judicable. But this is one instance. But there have been other instances even more striking recently. You may remember the operations of the Sentencing Council, which I have no idea why the Sentencing Council exists, but what it effectively says judges, and it's a group of judges and criminologists and other academic criminologists and other such doubtful people, telling judges that although the statute says, shall we say, that the sentence ought to be 10 years, you should really give a sentence of about 4. And it then started to say, and by the way, if you are dealing with people who belong to religious or racial minorities, you should actually refer them for as it were, social reports on them, which are inevitably or invariably a next step to the reduction of the sentence. So you effectively say that anybody who is, you were talking about minorities, anybody who belongs to a religious or racial or a gender minority or something shall receive special treatment, shall receive a lower sentence. They will be referred to a probation worker, to a social worker for investigation, and invariably, of course, it will come back that there are mitigating circumstances. So you introduce 2-tier sentencing. Now, what happens? Robert Jenrick, the Conservative Justice spokesman and Shadow Lord Chancellor, gets up and denounces this. The woman sitting opposite him in Parliament, Mahood, the herself clearly Muslim, nevertheless gets up and says this is completely wrong. That it is wholly wrong. That there should be this 2-tier sentencing, which seems to put one's, as it were, identity politics, gender, race, religion, above an equality before the law. She says this is absolutely wrong. What is the reaction of Lord Justice Davis, who is the chairman of the committee? No. What is the reaction of the Lady Chief Justice? It's intolerable that a politician says this. This is the law that has systematically got above itself. So as we've seen, the structure that Blair created with the quangos and whatever means experts get above themselves. The structure that the legal system has done means that judges, another group of unelected experts, get above themselves. And then in the middle, there is the civil service. Very sympathetic to quangos, very sympathetic to judges, and empowered by a civil service code to respect the rule of law, to be loyal to the crown as opposed to the government. You begin to see what I'm talking about, do you? That there's been this extraordinary. You can approach it with all kinds of metaphors. There's been a kind of, it's rather like a process of bleeding. In the old days you had medicine that depended on phlebotomy, on bloodletting. There's been a kind of progressive bloodletting from the body politic, which is one of the reasons that our politics seems so unable to do things. Or you can see it in another way. You can see it, there's that wonderful image in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, in which Gulliver is in the land of Lilliput, the little people, and he's tied down by these little people with all of these ropes. So you get the giant of the state knotted and tied down with this stuff. What is most striking of all, I think, is that the government itself, the Labour government, remember Starmer is a direct representative of all of this stuff. He's a human rights lawyer. His best friend are international lawyers. The people, I mean, the whole thing is a very intimate group of people. I mentioned Tom Bingham, the man who argued the case, Philip Sands, who argued the case for Mauritius and for the takeover of the Chagos Islands, wrote in The Guardian the hugely lengthy obituary of Tom Bingham. You know, the whole thing, Starmer's at the heart of this process as Director of Public Prosecutions. He was at the heart of this new approach to law as a human rights lawyer, as everybody has been pointing out. He campaigns for asylum seekers, against frontiers, against deportation. As Director of Public Prosecutions, he was at the heart of a branch of the civil service that has exercised profound and newfangled power and so on. He is a man at the absolute heart of this process, which is why when he came to power with the last election, he thought that all he needed to do was to seize control of Downing Street, which is why he chooses as his first aide Sue Gray, who had been the kind of dominatrix of the Cabinet Office, and he thinks that he can actually shape government by doing that. And then, of course, he finds out it doesn't work. Nothing happens, which is why suddenly we've seen Starmer, of all people, well, what have we done recently? Channeling his inner Enoch Powell and suddenly questioning, going as far as he possibly can, the application of human rights law to asylum seekers, and saying this has to be looked at again. Suddenly saying we will dissolve the quango. The biggest quango of them all is the NHS, well, the organisation which, in theory, the NHS Trust. With its head, former head, Amanda Pritchard, and deciding we will actually abolish this thing and take back direct control. Again, daring to say that the civil service often blocks government. What shock horror. Here's a man who's been at the heart of this process, is now beginning slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably, to realise that it stops the proper functioning of government. The sad thing is that the leader of the Conservative Party seems to be the last person to have noticed.
Finally, one of the last point I would like to make here is I would like to read you the quote that you yourself many times tried to quote, but of course didn't do it word for word. It was a quote from Benjamin Franklin. Those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. How true do you think this is in politics right now? And do you think people are prepared to give up their freedoms, such as the freedom of speech, especially on things like transgender issues, especially on things like LGBT issues, as you are gay yourself? How prepared are people to give up their freedoms for the perceived safety that the government might give them?
Well, and you could argue that they positively rushed to do it. If you looked at the enthusiasm for COVID, all of these fools getting outside, banging saucepans for the bloody NHS. There is a very strong element of conformism. I mean, we know this from war. People always talk about how terrible wars are. Actually, one of the surprising things is suicide rates go down
during the war.
During war, that there is inevitably there's a national hysteria that and again COVID was a form of hysteria, and people rather like this. We have a tremendous group instinct, and the comments of historians are always useful on this kind of thing. Lord Macaulay, Thomas Macaulay, has this wonderful phrase: there is nothing as ridiculous as the British public in one of its, listen to it, periodic fits of morality. periodic fit of morality. Well, COVID was a periodic fit of morality. But you see, I think there's something deeper. I mean, one of the things that's happened is that, and it's one of the reasons why all these changes have taken place. We didn't really have time to talk about it. Why has there been this distrust of the people? Why this distrust? Because it begins really in continental Europe. It begins in Germany in the post-war period. Very understandably, after the supposed participation of the German people in the horrors of Nazism, you develop the notion that, well, yes, democracy is a good thing, but it's a bit like an unruly child. It's a bit like me. It needs to have, when I'm talking about principles, it needs to have principles to hold it in leading chains. So what you do is you decide that you've got to have foundational principles like statements of human rights, which are enforced by experts, by judges, who mustn't be susceptible to popular pressure. What I think we've now gone, in fact, I would argue, as far as to have two completely different notions of democracy. The European democracy, the European idea of democracy as it's emerging, is effectively saying that, whereas democracy in the Greek means one very simple thing. It means rule by the people, or by the majority of the people. The continental tradition, particularly Germany, but with everywhere where the EU again was very much founded as an anti-democratic enterprise. The role of the Parliament in the European Parliament is a minor one. It's like the Estates General of old France, whereas the real governing body of the EU is a committee of experts. It's the Commission, who are very definitely not answerable directly to the people at all. But what you've got in continental Europe is a view that democracy is essentially about protecting the rights of minorities, which is why in Germany you've now actually got the attempt at outlawing whole political parties, because they dare to say perhaps being an ethnic German makes you more German than somebody who crossed over the frontier 3 weeks ago but's got a bit of paper. But you see, it's very like transgenderism. The whole of the left elevates words and paper above fact. If you've got a bit of paper which says you are a woman, it doesn't matter if you're a Willie, you're still a woman. The bit of paper makes you. And it's written, dare I say it, I have no idea what your religion is. I point out there's a very strong relationship between transgenderism and the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. The idea that a priest pronouncing the words hoc est corpus miraculously transforms bread into flesh, or wine into blood. That's, in other words, the primacy of language over fact. So there's that notion of democracy, and there's the American notion, especially vigorous under Trump, that democracy means what it says it does. I won. And that's why you have the great debate with J.D. Vance, the American vice president, going and addressing, was it the Council of Europe or whatever it was in Munich, and denouncing them and saying that what you're doing is anti-democratic. And you will remember the poor German chairman of the meeting was so hurt that he burst into tears at such wooed things being said. And so when we've abandoned the ordinary meaning of the word democracy, you've then got to come up with this new abusive term. So what we used to call democracy is now called populism. But if we actually go back to where we were on all of this, why has the need for the control of public opinion, what you were saying on transgenderism, on COVID, on above all race, why have you had to resort effectively to law or to social pressure, as it was through Twitter and the processes of cancellation? Because I would argue, from the 1960s onwards, we have effectively been governed by lies. The lie that diversity is our strength. Highly diverse societies are weak. They're entirely incapable of sustaining democracy. The only way, you come from Eastern Europe, that world, and Russia, that world of rival groups of towns which are German and Jewish and German speaking, surrounded and probably Protestant and Jewish, surrounded by peasants who speak a Slavonic language and are Orthodox. Those worlds can only be ruled by what they were ruled by. Absolute monarchs, by czars, by dictators. That's, I'm afraid, the price of diversity. You see it very clearly in modern terms in, for example, Yugoslavia. The extraordinary patchwork of different groupings which had characterized the Balkans because they were essentially where two empires had met, where Austro-Hungary to the north and the Ottomans to the south, and Yugoslavia carved out of this, when Tito and the conservative, again it begins with a C, and the Communist Party, and sometimes hard to tell the difference, and the Conservative, and the Communist Party ruled it, it was regarded as rather a model of a progressive, if you can have that word, a progressive communist society. The moment Tito goes, the thing turns into a war of all against all, and you have the intervention of Clinton, the EU, and you create this series of extraordinary little unsustainable statelets, which Kosovo and all the rest of it, all of which depend on foreign aid, foreign intervention, foreign troops, peacekeepers, and all this kind of thing. And the problem is, I think, that it's from 1965 onwards, from the Race Relations Act increasing and immensely intensified by Powell's 68 speech, there's been this, in many ways, for one could almost say noble, and indeed Tom Holland, the historian, when we were talking about the whole business of the rape gangs in the northern towns, which are overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim, and their victims are overwhelmingly little white girls, saying, well, actually, keeping quiet about this might have been wrong, but the aim was noble. And there's this strange turn. I referred to Aristotle. The other great theoretician, the other great Greek theoretician of politics is, of course, Plato. And Plato is the believer in the government by the expert, as opposed to Aristotle, who believes in participatory government. Aristotle has this wonderful line. When he's talking about government, he says, well, think of government as being a bit like cooking. The judge of a good meal is not the chef, it's the eater. And that seems to me to be exactly the right comment on the expert. But Plato takes completely the opposite view. Government is a task for the expert. And how do you get people to submit to the rule of the self-selecting expert? By a lie, by a myth, by a noble lie. And I think that our problem has been, and this is why all those Blairite structures were created, we've had a series of noble lies. We've had the lie about race relations, that diversity is our strength and immigration is a wholly good thing. We've had a lie about climate change. We've had lie after lie after lie. And what's happened, of course, is because people are not entirely stupid, they've begun to waken up. And this is what I think we're seeing. This is why the rise of reform. This is why figures like Farage, figures like Trump, suddenly are emerging. Why even figures perhaps like David Starkey. Those who dare to break the rules, those who say the unsayable. And we need to understand this. We need to understand the profound risk. I am a bit unusual with such people. I'm talking, when I talk about, criticise what Blair did, What I'm saying is, I want to go back. I want to restore. I don't want to tear things down. This is what I meant when I said I'd become a conservative. Again, we should be asking what our relationship with the past is. Remember, what the Blair government was all about was saying, just like the French Revolution 200 years before, that we can start the world afresh. If you remember, Tony Blair, this is the country with the oldest political system in the world. Now, I know about the Japanese emperor, the Mikado, but the structures of feudal Japan are wildly different from what Japan is after the Meiji restoration of the 19th century. Ours was the oldest tradition of politics. What does he say? He says we're a new country. We suffer this terrible dose of what I call neophilia. You know, necrophilia is having sex with dead people. Neophilia is falling in love with novelty. And it's fundamentally childish. It's childish. It's like fast fashion. It's political fast fashion. It's rotten. It's cheaply produced. It falls to bits quickly. It's terrible for the environment, and it will probably poison you. And that's exactly what Blairism has done.
David, thank you so much for the discussion. I almost felt like I'm back in school and being taught by a teacher, but unlike when I was in school, it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
He was a very naughty teacher, wasn't it? Yes.